Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Season 6, Episode 20 of the Roast West Coast Coffee Podcast. I'm Ryan Wolt, and this is the show where I bring you the stories of coffee professionals, entrepreneurship, and coffee smarter education. This is the very last episode of Season 6, and it's a great interview with Jack Quint. He founded and with his wife co-owns Deltina Coffee Roasters in Oceano, California. I'm going to start this show off with a bit of a geography lesson, just to give you some context on where Deltina is. Informally, the Central Coast region runs from just north of Ventura, California, up to Santa Cruz, where it runs into the Bay Area that surrounds San Francisco. Oceano is near Pismo Beach, close but not quite halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. The Central Coast is a combination of agricultural land, military base, and small beach communities, and it has the iconic coastal views associated with the rugged landscape of the drive through Big Sur. It's that stretch of highway that you often see in TV commercials for automobile makers. That's where you'll find Deltina Coffee Roasters, which opened in 2018. To get a better sense of that vibe, check out @Deltina Coffee on Instagram while listening to today's show. Jack was sitting outside, leaning up against the roastery while we chatted. As always, I'm going to play the interview and do a little recap. Be sure to stick around after that for details on a big change to the Roast West Coast Coffee podcast. And if you haven't already, go get a coffee. Fill up that mug. Maybe a traditional dark roast today. That's a bit of foreshadowing. And make sure you get it quick, because it's time for this interview with Jack Quint, founder of Deltina Coffee Roasters in Oceano, California, on the Roast West Coast Coffee podcast. And with that, I'd say, Jack, welcome to Roast West Coast. I really appreciate you being here and talking about what you do. I'm hoping we can start with just having you let our audience know what your name is, what your role is, what your coffee company is, what you're doing.
Absolutely. So my name's Jack Quint. I am the owner of Deltina Coffee Roasters. We're in Oceano, California. We opened our business about 4 years ago. My wife's my partner. We're an organic coffee roaster right on Highway 1 in Central Coast, California. We also have a full espresso bar. So yeah, excited to be here, and thank you, Ryan, for inviting me.
Oh, no, I'm excited you're here. I did some Google Earthing and Google Mapping to figure out where Oceano was. From the view, you're right by the beach, but it's not necessarily, you're not like in a major metropolis. You're not in a metro area, to say. You're kind of in the middle, and even in a more of an industrial area. How did you end up where you are?
Yeah, what the heck? Great question. So I had never heard of the Central Coast of California. I'm born and raised in Seattle. Through my previous career, I lived in DC and Chicago, but I actually met my now wife, who is a Cal Poly graduate. She got her graduate degree in Seattle. We met up there, and this was where she grew up vacationing. So Pismo Beach is a hotspot for the Central Coast. There's a lot of agricultural areas, little small towns out there, and they come out here when the summers get hot and vacation. And then there's also, like I said, Cal Poly. So it's a big college town just north of us. So I had never heard of this area. When we wrote the business plan and I got really interested in starting a coffee company, my number one protocol for a location was somewhere that my wife and I really love. And we were struggling. Do we go back to Seattle? Do we, go to California? Do we go in between in Oregon? And I asked my wife, where's your favorite place in the world? And she said, the Central Coast. San Luis Obispo was her happy place. So I scoped it out and saw there were very few specialty roasters out here. And I saw it was right on a real tourist highway. And so, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I got really excited, and we just didn't look back.
Well, now it's been several years. Have you been incorporated into the community? Did they accept you as one of their own? That's the big question.
Absolutely. We kind of went into, I was looking for an area that didn't have, 6 or 7 coffee roasters. Part of my vision for this business was educational, and I wanted to spark curiosity in the community I was going into. And I wanted people to walk in who had never seen a coffee roaster. So I picked an area where, historically there aren't a lot of coffee shops. We're like the first one. And absolutely, especially during COVID, tourism didn't exist. And we had, it was about a year into our operation, and we had this great flood of support come from the Oceano community and the surrounding areas. And they really kept us afloat. Everybody was ordering coffee online, and I was dropping off coffee at people's houses. And it was just really a windfall that we weren't expected at all. And it just really reaffirmed our decision to go into a smaller area versus trying to elbow our way into a more established region.
You mentioned that you wrote your business plan before choosing your location, but that means you were already thinking about coffee, already into coffee. So I want to go back a little bit in time and just, did you have an experience with coffee that made you think, yeah, this is something that I see being important to my life?
Yeah, it definitely came full circle. The Seattle weather, we were drinking coffee as 12, 13-year-olds just to get out the door on those dark winter days. In high school, just on a little bit of a whim, I had saved up some money, and I wanted to go visit my family in Ireland that I had never met, and my uncle agreed to go with me. My uncle has been a coffee roaster his entire life. He roasted for a bunch of companies in Seattle, and about 15, 20 years ago, he sold his house in Seattle and opened up his own small batch roastery in Central Washington. So him and I went on this trip in Ireland, and he brought a couple small little bags of coffee, and he brought, this was 10 years ago, he brought what was a single serve pour over contraption that I don't know who made it. I had never seen anything like it before. And I mean, every morning, I'd be making toast, and he'd be making us each a little cup of coffee. And he, this is a Guatemala, tomorrow we're having a Colombia. And to me, my first thought was, it's a lot of work. Like, they have coffee in Ireland. Why are you doing that? But it was just really cool. And seeing how much he could, this was his vacation, yet he still was spending 10, 15 minutes every single morning making a single cup of coffee. And I kind of went back to that. That was such a cool experience. Fast forward, ended up in Chicago working for larger companies. And I knew I wanted to get into something I was more passionate about. I kind of went full circle back with him and said, tell me again about what you do. Why do you do what you do? Went and visited his roastery one more time and just was hooked. So that was my first experience that really planted the seed that I would later cultivate, in my 30s into my own business. So.
Well, you just mentioned you were in Chicago. You're actually the second roaster I've had on this show who was a corporate accountant in Chicago.
Really?
Turned roaster.
Oh, man, that's funny.
Taylor Fields of Nostalgia Coffee. If anyone's listening, go back. That was a great interview. And she mentioned something that I wouldn't have thought about, because coming from restaurants, bootstrapping was my growth process. You always kind of do that. She was coming from a great career in corporate accounting and a lot of stability and a lot of easy future. Kind of, she could see that laying out and chose to leave that to jump into coffee. What made you think that was something you wanted to do? Obviously, you had this experience with your uncle, but was there fear when you made that leap? Was there, hesitation? How did your wife feel about giving up that and moving forward?
Great question. It was a tough sell. It really was. We had a lot of stability. I had almost a moment of panic when I was 10, 12 years into my career. Things started going really well. We had made a lot of sacrifices to get me to that point. We had moved our whole family out to Chicago to pursue this opportunity. And, it was almost the situation of the dog catching the mail truck. All of a sudden it was right there in front of me, and I had a panic because I realized that wasn't what I wanted the rest of my life. And it was this gut wrenching, okay, I have small kids. I know I don't want to do this the rest of my life. Well, now what? And I had to really it was gut check time, come up with another alternative. And once I did decide, I got really interested in sourcing my food while we lived out in Chicago. So Chicago is so much processed, it's where all the frozen burritos are made. And, a lot of the apples are, they ship them out the year before and they freeze them. So there's really not a lot of fresh produce out there. And so I got really interested in sourcing my own food personally and learning what goes into, is this granola bar really healthy or is it full of sugar? And so I got really passionate about that. I said, well, maybe I could do something. I saw this trend in the cities of younger consumers willing to pay more for a chicken breast if it's labeled organic from this farm, especially in the urban areas. So I saw this trend of, okay, there's this self-awareness that is developing. Maybe I could capitalize on that through coffee, and maybe if I could get people to stop going through drive-throughs where they get, really sugarized drinks, and instead walk in, see coffee being roasted, and really kind of start asking questions about where products are coming that they're putting into their body, that could be really cool. So I had to run some numbers, and I knew it wasn't going to be a home run. It took my wife and I a couple years of, okay, we're going to pay off all of our student loans. We're going to pay off all our cars. We saved up, and we ended up, cracking my 401k to do it. So it took us a number of years to feel like we were in the right place to do it. And then obviously with COVID, the rug got pulled out from under us, and looked very different than we had written it up. But it is very risky. My approach to it and what I told my wife is, worst case scenario, we fall flat on our face and we go back to doing what we were doing before. So when I left the company I'd worked for 10 years, I left on really good terms. And, relationships are crucial. I didn't burn any bridges. I told them what I was trying to do. And I told them, if it doesn't work out, do I have a spot to return to feed my family? And, they said, absolutely. So I was able to take a crack at it, knowing that if I had to fall back on something more secure, the door was always open.
Sure. You mentioned two things there that kind of stuck out to me. One was you wanted people to be able to come in and experience their relationship with coffee in the way that you were starting to do with the food you were sourcing. In Chicago, I'm from Wisconsin. It's farm country. I mean, I grew up not realizing this was a special thing, but like I knew people who worked on farms. We bought food from farms, meat and that kind of things. And you were starting to do that. I can hear beans being poured in the background there. Is that kind of the atmosphere you're trying to cultivate now with Deltina? And then you brought up coronavirus again, and I'm just wondering, obviously you had to pivot, you had to adjust and be flexible. What were some of those changes that you made, obviously, besides really honing in on your neighbors?
Yeah, absolutely. There were a couple things. Right off the bat, everybody was so scared, and I think everybody felt it. Customers were just projecting the stress onto our employees. So we had to do hey guys, we're allowed to stay open during the lockdown. Do you guys want to? There's these huge benefit packages out there if you guys don't want to work. But if you want to stay open, I'm game. And they did. So, okay, well, then we're going to really need to follow the rules and trying to kind of keep our ear to the ground. Things were changing so fast, and I felt like everybody had different recommendations. We had the CDC, we had the state of California, we had our own county. We had customers misinterpreting rules and coming in and yelling at us. The county was receiving complaints that the local police officers were hanging out at our coffee shop, just goofy stuff. So it was just a big distraction. It became, masking was so politicized that at first, we weren't going to tell people to wear a mask. Well, then the county was revoking business licenses if you weren't enforcing masking. Well, then we have, 18-year-old baristas asking, full-grown men to wear a mask who are very vocal about not wanting to wear one. And I'm going, what are we even doing? Like, we just want to serve coffee. Financially, there were some safety nets that came through. I had to call on some friends and family and, secure some financing just in case. We just didn't know how this thing was going to play out. I feel like because we stayed open during the lockdown and not a lot of other companies did, there was a little bit, there's silver linings everywhere. We were a pretty new company, and because we were the only open, shop in town, we got quite a bit of exposure that way. Every day is a little bit different. I think the biggest challenge was just trying to interpret the rules because they're changing so fast, and making sure that we're following the rules to the best of our abilities, and that our staff understand the rules, and that, the customers understand the rules. So that was our biggest challenge. It wasn't so much the financial side of it. It was just the misinformation and just how charged up everybody was.
I'm very COVID safe and aggressively about that. And I appreciated businesses that went out of their way to do that. But as a former restaurant person who's been through a localized outbreak of a virus, Hep C, I also understood how difficult it was when I had to go to my staff and say, hey, you can get vaccinated. Hey, we have to do these things to prevent it. And you mentioned something I think is really interesting, and something that you might not think about on the other side, but you have essentially kids engaging with the community and trying to enforce rules and laws. And that's
Absolutely
difficult. It's a challenge, absolutely. So finding what workarounds around that was certainly difficult.
Absolutely.
I want to make sure that we're talking about your coffee today.
Sure.
You mentioned to me before the show in a note that you sent that you have been focusing on some of the darker roasts, kind of going against the trend. I'm wondering why you've chosen to do that. And one of the reasons that really kind of sparked interest in me is I have several family members and friends who ask me, hey, when are roasters going to make dark roasts again?
Sure.
It's one of those things. So what inspired you to go that way?
My approach to coffee roasting, I really looked for mentors and took advice everywhere I could get it. But at the end of the day, I decided I'm going to kind of trust my gut, roast coffees, buy coffees that I like, and hope that people get on board with it. I don't want to be trying to do what everybody else is doing. I don't want to be pivoting and doing what I think people are going to like. I'm going to really lean into it, learn the coffees the best I can. Coffee roasting is all trial and error. I'm going to do my diligence, cut my roast when I'm done. I've found, especially for espressos or any non-filtered coffees, I just really like dark roast. And there's a way to do it without getting a lot of burnt bitterness in it. And I think it's a little bit of a lost art. And I did notice, I said, wow, this light roast thing's really trendy. But I've heard from people who have been roasting, 20, 30, 40 years that it's cyclical. And sometimes the dark roasts come back around. The last couple of years, light roasts are really the popular thing. And so I said, okay, well, I like a light roast, but I don't want to drink it every day. So, I do one. I've tried every one of my blends through our espresso machine, and I just I really enjoy a darker roast espresso. I think, if I get any hints of the acidity, to me, it tastes sour. And I'm just very passionate about that. So I kind of started with developing my espresso blend, and then I kind of went from there. But I think, there's a lot of stigma out there, and I've gotten a lot of pushback, just misinformation of, well, I heard that people that roast dark roast buy cheap coffee, and that's how you disguise flaws, is you roast it dark. Some people do that, yes. Yes, you can disguise flaws in coffee by roasting it dark. I pay $5 a pound for coffee. I buy very high-end coffees, which by roasting it dark, you can transform certain flavors. You can take these sweeter floral notes and you can transform them into this chocolatey molasses note. So I also am constantly battling that, well, I heard light roast has more caffeine. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But I just tell people, drink what you like. If you find a dark roast you like, you're going to get caffeinated. I like that the darker roast, because of the lack of acidity, they're easier on your stomach. I can drink multiple cups a day and I don't, have as many issues. So circling back, my philosophy is just to trust my gut and my palate and roast coffee the way I like it, present it the way I like it. And I know some people will love it, some people won't. I have people that ask, do you do super light roast? No, but I know 3 or 4 roasters in this area that do. And I send them to him. I say, hey, go check out this guy. He's a mile up the street. I think you're going to like what he does. And he does the same for me. If people show up and want dark roast, he kicks them down our way. So it's fun. It's collaborative.
You're roasting your dark roast on a San Franciscan roaster, which I just think they're beautiful looking machines. But there are so many options out there. How did you end up with that machine, especially since you were coming into roasting with kind of some guidance from your Uncle Dan?
Sure.
But coming from a different career, how did you end up there?
Sure. I mean, it was very overwhelming. I started looking into the major manufacturers. I was in Chicago at the time. Probat had a new North American plant just north of Chicago. So met with them a couple times. I think the older Probat roasters are really cool to me. The newer ones, I didn't love quite as much. I looked into, being in California, Lorien, their sales seems pretty aggressive. I met with them a couple times. I got a good piece of advice to look at the roasters that are placing at the national competitions and look what kind of roasters they're using. So look for something that's battle tested. So, I knew as a new roaster, I'm not an engineer. That's not my background. I'm not going to buy a 70-year-old roaster. That's too much baggage for me. So on my way out here, I had a couple different manufacturers in mind. I was driving cross country with my family, and we were planning to stop in Denver, and I ended up breaking down in Denver, and I put my wife and my kids on a plane to to Fresno, and I hung out with my sister in Denver for a couple of days. And so I said, okay, well, let's go check out a couple coffee roasters while I'm here. And Sweet Bloom, I don't have permission to use their name on this, but Sweet Bloom had just placed second in a Brewers Cup in Salt Lake City. So I said, hey, let's go check those guys out. They had 2 San Franciscan roasters. I had honestly never heard of San Franciscan. The owner happened to walk by, and I caught him and said, hey, Andy, why are you a San Franciscan roaster? And he said, they're just workhorses. He said he had his SF25 and he ran it every day, and it just consistently produced results. And so I ended up calling this company, and, I ended up talking to either the owner or the owner's brother, and really, again, started the relationship. I wasn't talking to a salesman. I was talking to the head technician, and, developing that relationship with them. I just felt like if I had an issue, they would answer the phone, and they have. So, that small company feeling, it's just, I didn't want to get a sales rep. I didn't want to talk to, a technician out in the field. If I had a roaster, I had an issue with my vent one day, and I called, and the main customer service person at San Franciscan didn't answer, and they put it through to Bill Kennedy, who's the owner of San Franciscan. He was in, Seoul, Korea at some convention, and he answered. He's like, oh, I'm in Korea right now. Could I call you in the morning? I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. But that's the kind of thing that, I haven't experimented with a lot of other roasters, but I feel like I have such a good relationship with San Franciscan at this point. They really show up for their customers. So that's how I ended up with a San Franciscan, and I'm very happy with that decision.
That's a really a value add, I think, to you as the roaster. And this is just kind of my soapboxing for the audience a little bit. But when you are going into that process of buying something, you need to think about the maintenance expenses and the long-term expenses, not just the first price that you pay. Because if it's $5,000 cheaper, but there's nobody to work on it, or there's no way to get any assistance, it's going to cost more in the long run.
Absolutely. And, this coffee equipment is so specialized that I can't call an electrician to come work on my coffee roaster. They've never seen anything like it. They don't want to. My afterburners having issues. I've called 8 or 10 different heating companies locally. Wait, it's a coffee roaster? Yeah, we don't do that. So I really had to lean in and learn a lot of it myself. And that's where having that, relationship really has paid dividends.
You the coffee that you are serving, you mentioned you pay $5 a pound, give or take, which is a higher price for coffee especially than the C market.
Uh-huh.
You also serve coffees that are organic, I think mostly exclusively, and fair trade as often as you can. Why is that important to you, or why did you choose to go that route? You mentioned earlier you were getting into the sourcing of your food. I'm assuming that's part of that inspiration.
Yep. Great question. So when I started getting into roasting and actually making green coffee purchases, I had realized before I started this in Denver that, how the consumer has a lot of power. And I think people kind of forget that, even with the larger companies, if there's a need, large companies will pivot and try and fill that need. So as a consumer, the way we spend our money it can really help shape policy and impact, the behavior and policies of others. So it's a small part, but I figure, well, if I'm going to be buying green coffee, I want to be doing it in a way that I feel good about. And, coffee, yes, there are a lot of chemicals, in some growing operations. To me, it was more about how do I reward farmers that are growing sustainably. And through my research, I discovered that while it's not a perfect system, operations that grow organically, because they can't use a lot of the fertilizers and a lot of the pesticides, they really have to treat the trees well. They have to spread them out. They can't overplant, and they have to do it in a sustainable way. So, and the organic market is so regulated that, while there's a lot of fraud in it, generally I know if my importer is certifying something organic, it's going to be organic. So I made a decision to purchase exclusively organic coffee, not because I'm an organic nut, but because I felt that it was the way to best reward the farmers that are growing using sustainable practices. Fair trade is great. There are a lot of these programs. There are definitely steps in the right direction. It's not an end all be all. It's not a solution. So little of coffee is certified fair trade that, to be providing coffee to other businesses and keep my flavor profiles consistent, I just made the decision I can't be exclusively fair trade. I'm already pretty pigeonholed being just organic, and it creates some challenges sourcing beans at certain times of the year. So if I have the option to buy fair trade, I will, but I am 100% exclusively organic.
Well, and it's important to note that fair trade is a certification that farmers have to pay for, and that may not always be available to them as well. I also want to
Absolutely.
point out, if you're listening, you can't see Jack, but I can. And when he started talking about organic and sustainability, a ray of sun literally came out and illuminated him on my screen. So there
Look at
must
that.
be something to that. I haven't been to your shop. I have traveled kind of that direction, and I certainly will again. I'm based here in Southern California. When I walk into Deltina, what is the experience like? What is the vibe? What is, you mentioned another roaster down the road, so it's obviously been growing since you've moved in.
Hmm?
What is that Central Coast coffee region experience like?
It's really important to us that everybody feels welcome. So when we first were building out this location, Oceano itself historically is a very heavy Latino neighborhood. And over the last 5 or 10 years, there have been a lot more investors setting up Airbnb type properties in Oceano because it's so close to the beach. So when I set up, I had eyes on me going, is this gentrification? And so I had to just walk around giving out hot chocolates to kids, waving to people, showing, look, everybody's welcome. So when people walk in, we really make a point to smile, good morning, how are you? Come on in. Specialty coffee is very intimidating. So people walk in, I don't know what to order. I've never been here. Okay, what do you like? And we try and get that dialogue going. It's also really important to us. You walk in, the first thing you see is our roaster. It's in the back, but we have a line of sight. And then I have all my inventory right there next to the roaster. So it's very open. I don't encourage customers to go open my green beans and look in them, but we have it set up. We're trying to encourage the dialogue. We want people to feel welcome. We want to spark that curiosity and then have a great customer experience as well.
You had mentioned earlier that, and I just want to come back around to this, but that there were other roasters in the area. Who are the customers outside now that the world has opened up again? Who is coming to visit you besides your neighbors, or is it still kind of exclusively local neighborhood vibe that you guys have?
We're definitely seeing an uptick in international travel. What was really cool about our location when we first opened is we're on Highway 1, but right next to us is kind of a major highway. So if you're on Highway 1, Pacific Coast Highway, you're either a local or you're just joyriding. So what was really neat and why I chose this location was I talked to a couple other business owners and they said, yeah, all July, Europe's on holiday. And the travel agencies sell these bucket list vacation packages where you fly into San Francisco, you rent an RV, you drive down the coast to LA, you circle back around and hit Vegas on the way back. So, okay, that's cool. So all July, we have people from all over Europe. And, the Europeans, they love espresso and they like the dark roast. Oh my gosh, this is, I've been in America a week and this is the first European style espresso I've had, which is really exciting for us. So July, and we're starting to see an uptick again. We see a lot of Europeans, we see a lot of South Africans, and then in August, not try to be stereotypical, but later in the summer, a lot of the Asian countries go on their holiday. So then we see this other influx from Korea, Japan, and it's just really fun. So we get a great mix of the locals, and then we have people just from all over the world. And so my background, I used to work in international tax, and I used to help non-U.S. companies set up U.S. subsidiaries. And what was really cool about that was that I got to work with all these non-U.S. businesses and learn the way, how do you do business in the Netherlands? When do people get into the office? When do people vacation or holiday? That was one of the few things I really enjoyed about my previous career. And being where we are now, I get to talk to people from all around the world all summer. And it's kind of got to take a piece of that with me. And it's really fun. So being able to find common ground with people and learn, how they serve a macchiato in the Netherlands or, Turkish coffee, whatever. People from all over the world have their own practices and it's fun to kind of pick their brains and find some common grounds with them.
Sure, and coffee is one of those very few things that unites 99% of the world
Yeah, it's amazing, right?
and growing. You chose where your shop is. You made a decision as a family to come there. Now that you're there and you've been in business for 4 years,
Mhm.
going on 5 probably, I believe. You've been through this massive business nightmare called the pandemic,
Mhm.
and you're still open. What's something that you've learned over the last several years, kind of through that experience, that you're going to take with you moving forward?
That's a great question. Really, to trust my gut, and you really need to be persistent when starting a new business. And I feel like I've talked to so many potential coffee professionals that it sounds like a fun idea, and they get into it and they hit a couple roadblocks and they give up. And well, I was going to open a coffee roaster in Santa Barbara, but it's really hard to get a permit. Okay, so you just stopped. So we hit a lot of roadblocks. In addition to the COVID stuff, getting our building up to code was just a nightmare. And we just you hit these little roadblocks, and I've learned that if you just push through it, you'll eventually get there. And you're going to make mistakes. Obviously, anything you go into for the first time. So just be patient and get used to saying, well, right now this is the best I can do, and I'm proud of that. And knowing that we're all flawed, and you're not going to do anything perfect, but it's important to just keep pushing and keep moving forward. So after all we've been through over the last couple of years, I learned a ton. I learned to trust my gut. I've learned to not suffer in silence when things are going sideways or you're scared. Pick up the phone and call somebody who's been in the industry for a long time, or call a family member, call a friend, and just say, hey, I'm struggling. I'm stressed. I don't know if my kids are going to go to school this year. I don't know if we're going to be able to stay open, and just get it. That suffer in silence is kind of part of our culture. But yeah, I feel, don't dump your problems on people, but, fall back on support when you need it. And, there's a group of people around you that will usually rally. And, I say a business like this, it takes a village. I couldn't have done this on my own without the support of my family and my community. So that's something I've taken with me is to fall back on that support when you need it.
Suffer in silence. You definitely spent time in the Midwest. That's how we approach all of our problems. What's something that I didn't ask you today that I should have, or what should people know about Deltina or about you that we didn't get a chance to cover today?
Um, one reason that I really wanted to get into coffee is I went to a couple trade shows before I was a professional, and the culture is just amazing. It's very collaborative. And, being in a small town, I felt like the small business owners are less so and a little bit more territorial. But I found coffee as a whole is very collaborative. And, like I said before, it took a village to kind of get our business to where it is today. And so I'm always looking for ways to pay it forward. For example, there's another coffee roaster behind me using my roaster because he had to move his roaster this week, and he didn't have anywhere to roast, and he called me, yeah, you can use my roaster. So, I'm here, I'm available, I'm happy to be a resource. If anybody's listening to this and they think they might want to go into coffee roasting, or they want to know, realistically what it looks like every day. I've had people say, oh, I want to be a coffee roaster. Can I, mentor you one day? And they said, well, I don't like lifting coffee bags. It's like, well, what do you think we were doing here? So if you think you're interested, reach out. People love talking about what they do. This is a perfect example. It's really fun for us. So reach out. You can always email me. You can always call me. I'm happy to collaborate. I'm happy to kind of, impart whatever knowledge I've gained over the last few years into the next generation.
The last thing I always ask every guest is, the next time you're out and about, you're on the one and you're just traveling on your own, and you pull over at an unknown coffee shop or roaster, what are you going to order for yourself?
That is a great question. I'm an Americano guy, especially in the afternoon. I love decaf Americanos. So few people really put as much effort into their decaf as they do their non-decaffeinated coffees. So if I'm scoping somebody out, I'll order decaf Americano just to see if they're really on their game. It totally depends on, this is a great question. Depends on the time of day. If it's, 6 a.m, I'll get, 4 shots over ice. If it's later in the afternoon, decaf Americano. If it's just after lunch, I might get, splash of, vanilla latte. I don't know. I'm a big oat milk fan. So I usually put a splash of oat milk in a drip. I like drip coffee. I drink drip coffee all day long. So great question. Anything else you want to talk about, Ryan?
Yeah. I mean, do you ever sleep? I'm assuming if you're 4 shots and then drip and then coffee in the afternoon.
I drink a lot less coffee as a coffee professional than I did in an office job. I feel like I drank coffee just because I was bored. Whereas now, I don't drink coffee in the morning because I'm so excited to come down and cup, the batch I ran 2 days ago. I drink little bits here and there. If I pull a double shot, I'll take a sip of it. I'm not going to down it. If I try our cold brew, I'll have a couple sips, and then I usually cut it off, by about noon. But yeah, coffee for me, like I enjoy drinking it so much more now because it is part of my profession that it's not a drug to me anymore. It's really something I love.
Well, Jack, I really appreciate you taking the time to just chat with me and all of our listeners. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it.
Of course, this was fun.
Okay, to recap, you will hit roadblocks, lots of them. Some little and some big, and you have to push through them to get to where you want to go. It's a lesson that Jack has learned, and the more I think about it, the more I find it applies to just about everything, not just business, but life in general. At Deltina Coffee, they roast on a San Franciscan roaster. It's a brand that Jack came across through the recommendation from another roaster. Word of mouth goes a long way when starting a business. And here's a little bit of unsolicited equipment advice. When pricing out equipment, be it an espresso machine for your new cafe or a coffee grinder for home, consider the long-term expenses. Is it cheaper now but harder and more expensive to fix? How long will it last? Is it more or less efficient than another option? For example, I bought a grinder that was a little bit less expensive because the version I chose did not have a static free cup to catch the grinds. It was like $20 difference, and I regret that choice because of the mess that gets made when I'm pulling the grind cup out, leaving behind a mess of grinds that stick to the cup and get all over the place, and so on. The waste I create may not be worth $20 of coffee, even over time, but I'm also spending more time cleaning up my coffee station and generally just being annoyed in the morning when I should be enjoying my cup of coffee. Jack mentioned the rabbit hole that is caffeine in coffee. The caffeine content differences between light and dark roasts are relatively minimal. What will have more of an impact on your caffeine intake will be the size of the grind, the brewing method, its concentration, and especially the variety of coffee. A longer roast can slightly reduce the caffeine content, but then how you measure your grinds to water ratio will be more indicative of the caffeine that eventually ends up in your cup. More than anything, this conversation with Jack inspired me to consider where people choose to live, where we, my wife and I, have chosen to live. Is it most impacted by our careers, by family, community, lifestyle? How do we weight those, and how does being an entrepreneur impact those choices? There don't seem to be right answers, nor do there have to be. But taking time to assess the question every now and again might help create a life lived better. Finally, Jack thinks crafted dark roasts are becoming a lost art, one that he gladly continues because he roasts coffee that he likes. And at Deltina, he hopes to create a space where we as guests can experience more than just the taste of coffee. If you want to reach out to Jack or the Deltina team, follow at Deltina Coffee on Instagram or head to deltinacoffeeroasters.com. Of course, you can also head to roastwestcoast.com to find those links and read the newsletter that accompanies this podcast. On to some podcasting news. After Season 6 and 130 episodes interviewing coffee industry professionals about their entrepreneurial journeys, personal motivations, and experiences in coffee, and the sharing of their coffee smarter knowledge in pursuit of a better cup of coffee at home or a coffee experience out in the world, I think it's fair to say we have a pretty good sample size of what works and what people want from this show. That, combined with feedback from listeners like you, has inspired a huge change in the format. Specifically, we are splitting it in half. Roast West Coast will remain a coffee podcast focused on telling the stories of coffee industry professionals through interviews with roasters, coffee shop owners, baristas, farmers, and so on. And we're launching an entirely new second podcast called Coffee Smarter, where we'll focus on coffee education that is specifically targeted towards helping you make a better cup of coffee at home, along with a little bit of history to improve your coffee drinking experience, either at home or out in the world. Season 1 of Coffee Smarter is going to focus on the different at-home brewing methods. We'll break down the V60 pour-over, the French press, the Chemex, and more. We're going to focus on how and why they may be a good fit for you. The episodes will be more compact and provide all the knowledge you need to make a great cup of coffee. If you already subscribe to the Roast West Coast Coffee Podcast newsletter, paid or free, nothing will change for you. You'll get both shows sent right to your email, just like always. And you can always go right to roastwestcoast.com to listen to any of the shows. But if you listen to the podcast on Spotify, Apple, or any of the other many platforms where great podcasts are heard, you'll want to follow and subscribe to the Coffee Smarter podcast. This might be a pretty good time to subscribe to the coffee newsletter at roastwestcoast.com, but if not, find Coffee Smarter Podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Helping me split the show in two is the continued support from our coffee industry partners, including Café Laterre, Moster Coffee Company, Steady State Coffee Roasting, Camp Coffee Company, Coffee Cycle Roasting, Ignite Coffee Company, Maria Coffee, Cape Horn Coffee Importers, Zumbar Coffee and Tea, and Ascend Coffee Roasters. The founder of Ignite Coffee Company, Tyler Whitehead, just sent me some photos of the interior of their new cafe space in Oceanside, which I posted on @RoastWestCoast on Instagram and Facebook. The coffee bar is in, and the espresso machine is unboxed. They are on the precipice of opening. It's an exciting time over there, and I'm stoked to be one of the first in line to get a cup of coffee when they open the doors. Thank you to everyone listening to this show, reading the newsletter at roastwestcoast.com. Don't forget to search for and follow the Coffee Smarter podcast as soon as possible, like right now. Please and thank you. This episode of the Roast West Coast Coffee Podcast, the last of Season 6, has been written, produced, and recorded by me, Ryan Wolt. I hope this episode has found you happy, healthy, and with at least enough sanity to make it through the day. Always tip your baristas, and be sure to drink good coffee. Hey everyone, thank you for sticking around. Once again, I have some last requests of you today. First, please go get your flu shot, get that COVID booster, or even your first COVID shot. It isn't too late. My amazing wife works in the school system with kids, mostly with special needs, and many of them are still considered at risk and haven't been able to get vaccinated the way the rest of us have. Staying healthy and getting those shots helps prevent the spread of viruses, which in turn protects kids and adults who don't have the benefit of a strong immune system, not to mention the rest of the people we love. It is a very good thing to do. Second, please vote. If you are listening to this the day it drops, tomorrow is the last day to vote in the midterms, which are incredibly important. Finally, treat yourself to a good cup of coffee. You've earned it. Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Ryan Wolt. I'm the host of the Roast West Coast Coffee Podcast. And for the first time in 7 seasons, we're splitting the show in half to bring you a new version of our popular Coffee Smarter series. The Coffee Smarter podcast will be focused on helping you create a better cup of coffee and a better coffee experience at home, while also sharing the history, economy, and impacts on culture that your cup of coffee has on the world. Season 1 is focusing on the methods of coffee brewing that you might use at home. Be sure to bookmark the Coffee Smarter podcast on your favorite podcast platform like Apple or Spotify, or just sign up for one of the free or paid newsletter options at roastwestcoast.com and get access to every episode of the brand new Coffee Smarter podcast. Season 1 coming soon.